Great. I've got a little question. You mentioned MLAs voting in 2024. I didn't understand the abbreviation.
Oh, apologies. That's members of the Legislative Assembly.
Okay, right.
Interestingly enough, they were quite clever in the legislation that underpins that in the UK, because it does allow for the fact that if the Northern Ireland Assembly isn't sitting, which is a possibility, obviously it's been suspended a number of times. It's allowed for the fact that even if the Northern Ireland Assembly isn't up and running, that the MLAs, so those who are voted in, still have to have that vote. You see what I mean? So it's not possible for that vote not to happen, even if the Assembly itself is suspended.
Am I right in thinking that the members of the Legislative Assembly are voted in by proportional representation and the Westminster by first past the rotten post?
Yes.
So
yes.
How is that going to, so it's likely that the MLA will become more nationalist much faster than possibly without boundary changes, or then they become more prominent. Well, they won't take their seats anyway. The Sinn Féin people won't take their seats, but so you're always going to get in a bit of an imbalance there, aren't you? And attention.
Well, not necessarily. So the reason it's PR is to try and get a better reflection of diversity of opinion and identities and traditions in the constituencies. And that's really interesting to see. You know, if you look at the results from assembly elections, you know, you can have obviously constituencies returning a DUP MLA and a Sinn Féin MLA, you know, so you can see it's a better representation of the diversity of opinion. First past the post doesn't do that, but actually if you look at the Sinn Féin portion of seats, it is significant too in Westminster. And the DUP were very unhappy with what happened in the last general election. They were losing seats. Those seats went to, interestingly enough, the Alliance Party and the SDLP, so sort of moderate grounds. And I think that can be partly understood through irritation at the DUP in some quarters, but also through a pro-Remain vote that was coming through then. And even though it seems a long time ago and hard to believe, there was a hope by some parties, including the SDLP, which is the moderate nationalist party, and Alliance, that there would be a second referendum. And I think that boosted those results as well. But to answer your question, it is possible to anticipate having a nationalist majority of seats in Westminster as well as in the Assembly.
So what do you think are the prospects of changes to the protocol, making the system workable? Can you see progress in the current negotiations?
That's such a good question. And I think changes are possible. What the EU has said in terms of its so-called non-papers, in terms of the flexibilities that it's saying it's willing to show, is really significant, because this is uncomfortable for the EU, and also they have to bring all the member states with them. And we have seen evidence of genuine interest from the EU side in trying to find solutions to, as I say, really complex technical matters. And it is sort of, it's a very detailed process that's needed. And essentially, it's also important that they hear from experience here in Northern Ireland, from business and others, around what are the difficulties here, because it's, those difficulties are felt in sort of the back rooms of small businesses, etc., as they struggle to upload the necessary information on the online forms, etc. So I think flexibilities can be found. However, there is the big issue here, which is always around, the challenges, the hard Brexit and the limitations of the trade and cooperation agreement. And it is very clear that if, for example, there was a Swiss-style veterinary agreement, that would resolve a huge number of the most difficult challenges that are being faced with the protocol. So even though the EU is prepared to move, the UK also needs to give as well. So it's not just up to the EU to come up with these technical solutions, not least because, as I mentioned, these problems will grow over time. So even if we get technical solutions for problems that exist today, as the UK diverges, new problems will arise. Now, there is the capacity of the institutions overseeing the protocol, the UK-EU Joint Committee with Liz Truss and Maroš Šefčovič. So they have capacity to make decisions, but you have to have the foundation upon which those decisions can be made. And essentially, that's a lot to do with trust. To go back to Alison's question around Dominic Cummings, can the EU trust the UK to implement this thing? So even if they show more flexibility, that comes at a price, and that is exposing a bit of risk for the EU's point of view. So the more the UK can show themselves to be trustworthy and sincere in actually wanting to implement this thing, the more flexibility the EU can show. And this is why we just seem to go a little bit round and round in circles. However, I'll try and finish on an optimistic note. We do know that the relationship between, as I say, the co-chairs of the Joint Committee does seem to be better than and less frosty, shall we say, than it was before Christmas. And we do hear very clearly that Liz Truss does want to get a deal. So hopefully she will be confident in showing that a deal with the EU, even though it will involve movement and accommodation on the UK side, in the long term will bring this sort of stability that.
But I do feel that it's been ill-served pretty much since, well, with the ways this has been allowed to happen over the years. And I'm not talking just Brexit, I'm talking 60 years. It's been ill-served, and it's not really been regarded by the rest of Britain as the same. Hence, people feeling that they're not really, loyalists don't. People don't want to join Southern Ireland feel, well, we might as well join because we're not really British or included any of the nations, and loyalists or unionists feeling, well, you don't regard us as actually British either. And most British people actually don't. I'm sorry to say, they don't really understand Northern Ireland at all. It's got an interesting history. And I'm going back, go back hundreds of years, like everywhere in Britain, massively interesting history. Unfortunately, it's pretty blood-soaked.
So, and the polling that we do, we ask about trust in the UK government and trust in the Irish government and the EU, to handle Northern Ireland's interest on the protocol. And our polling on this for the EU and Irish government is around, it's around 42% trust them, 45%. Okay. For the British government, 4%.
Wow, that's bad.
Yeah, 46%. So, and that's basically because nationalists don't trust them,
and the unionists think they've been sold them down the river.
Unions don't trust them either, and this kind of explains the context within which they're trying to.
I still can't understand why unionists didn't vote against Brexit, because it's in their interest to keep the status quo. They have probably more power.
Well, even if they had, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. But the Ulster Unionist Party campaigned to remain, but after the referendum result, and we saw, our survey work showed that, the majority of Ulster Unionist Party's supporters voted to leave, then they changed their cabinet. So then it became much more of a sort of a unionist, nationalist and other splits that we're now.
Yeah, I mean, I'd hope that, as younger people actually get more active politically, or about how their country, their part of the world is, they will get away from sectarian divides and actually think, right, what's good for everybody here? Religion shouldn't be an issue anymore. I mean, I know it was an issue for hundreds of years in Britain too, but not for at least 200 or 300 years. And I hope Ulster, well, the 6 counties opposed to the 9 would change. What about America's influence now on the whole Brexit process and actually trying to do something there? Do you feel there's a lot of undue or strong influence from America?
Obviously, they're critically important, and America's critically important as ally of the EU as well as the UK. And we've seen the importance of the American concern or interest in Northern Ireland at critical points during the Brexit process. So one is when Speaker Nancy Pelosi came over here.
Yeah.
She was in London as well, but she came here and she made very explicit statements that the Good Friday Agreement had to be protected and a hard Irish border had to be avoided. And then most recently, last autumn, when there was when Lord Frost was increasingly referring to the possibility of triggering Article 16, the US stepped in there as well, to sort of say that the protocol had to be, you know, it was a legal agreement and they needed to work
to be abided by.
So there's a critical and also bear in mind, of course, that a trade deal with the US was often, you know, was pointed to.
That was something mooted under Trump, but it seems to be in a cupboard somewhere, and there's dust. It's gathering, and it's guarded by spiders right now. Well, it's quite interesting. I just want to talk about this amazing trade deal with our great buddies in America. I used to live in America as a teenager, and on St. Patrick's Day, even black people in America are Irish. Everybody wears green. It's just a thing, you know. Maybe they don't hate British people. It's cooled down after, you know, the American Revolution, but I don't think, this is my view again, I don't think people in the rest of Britain understand this trade deal is not happening.
I just want to say that the reason why I'm interested in this is purely and simply because I passed the bookstore in Waterstones. I am now addicted to the works of Fintan O'Toole. And he has, you laugh at that, I don't quite know what the laugh means, but he's turned somebody who had no reason to be particularly interested in this, into somebody who's burning with passion. And actually I've got an inner rage over something which actually doesn't concern me, and that is through his works, because he is a very persuasive, emotive, and in my opinion a very good writer. And his books actually predate the protocol, but he persuaded me in his books that he wrote about Brexit that Brexit could never happen because there would never be a solution over it. And he said Brexit consists of people, money, and Ireland. We can sort out the people, we can sort out the money, but we will never sort out Ireland. Now, in the end, Brexit did go ahead, and I thought he's got to be right, and I didn't expect Brexit to happen. It did, and that's because Boris Johnson stuck his signature on the protocol. We've subsequently heard Dominic Cummings saying that Boris Johnson knew Scooby-Doo about the protocol. Now, if this is so, if this is the picture which is true, why is it people so matter of fact over it? And the other reason for me to wonder that is because I've done a course about the expansion of the European Union and its history, and at City Lit with somebody called Hilke Goodall, and she said that the reason why Ireland joined, the Republic of Ireland joined the European Union in the first place was because it had to, because the UK did. So things are not adding up, and I'm just wondering if all what I've said rings some sort of bells of truth, or there's any truth in it. Why are we just being matter of fact about the protocol because there's no other choice? Okay,
those are good questions, Alison. And the reason I mean, Fintan O'Toole is an outstanding intellectual and commentator, and I have to say one of the highlights of my career so far was being on a panel with him, and he's marvelous. And he's able to say things that I wouldn't say as an academic. You know, I try and be much more, but he's absolutely fiercely intelligent and writes brilliantly. So I'm delighted that you're reading his books. And just before I try and answer your question, and you mentioned you said about him filling you with interest or something that doesn't concern you, and I would say, on the contrary, it should concern everybody in Britain. And this isn't just because of the impact of protocol, etc. It's because the Good Friday Agreement is genuinely a British-Irish agreement. And we know just quite how much the Troubles in Northern Ireland badly affected Britain, nowhere near as intensely as it affected Northern Ireland, but there is a legacy of that trauma and loss in Britain as much as, you know, as well as here. And in that way, the Good Friday Agreement generally was a huge achievement for the UK and something it should be proud of and care about. So anybody who is concerned around what's still happening here in Northern Ireland, I'm very glad of that and grateful for it. And I think in part to begin to answer your question now, I don't know. I don't know, Dominic Cummings tweeting that or saying that about Boris Johnson not having a Scooby-Doo about the protocol. I don't know how much of a Scooby-Doo he has about anything that he signs into legislation, right? Or indeed about the basics of what Brexit means, or indeed what European integration was all about. So I wouldn't, the fact, maybe he did know, maybe he didn't know the ramifications of it. If he took care to look at reports that were being issued by, for example, House of Lords committees on the protocol, some of us gave evidence very carefully in detailed way on what the protocol meant in practice. It's not easy to read, but then it would have been very, very apparent what they were signing up to. So the fact that he wasn't sincere potentially on that shouldn't diminish our the legal status of the protocol, or indeed the UK's obligations to implement it. As I say, I think a big part of the problem with the protocol is that, well, for starting, Northern Ireland, engagement with Northern Ireland, and trying to look at evidence from Northern Ireland, was very minimal at the time of the negotiations. And for some reason you could say, well, that's fair enough, it's a tiny region, but actually that was sort of borne through in this high-level agreement that was essentially doing what Theresa May had done her best not to do, and that was to shift the border lock, stock and barrel pretty much into the Irish Sea. Theresa May's version of the protocol would have committed to some degree the Britain aligning with rules in order to reduce any such border, and that's why it was voted down by the hardline Conservatives. So I understand, I think, where you're coming from, but I would say actually it's not necessarily a reason to doubt it. And I think it's a highly complex, highly unusual arrangement, and to manage it now will take, as I say, will take care. And we're still seeing the difficulties now. These current talks between the UK and the EU, they're really, really technical, really specific things that nobody in Northern Ireland or the rest of the UK had to really deal with before. Just as people in Britain, businesses trying to trade as they did before with the EU, just coming across these things they've never had to think about. And it's not just businesses who are exporters, it's also obviously people who are bringing in things, importing goods. Even people like, traveling with band equipment, and if they're doing a gig across in the EU, all of these things, just we haven't had to deal with them for so long. So it is a new experience, and trying to bring that within the UK brings its own difficulties. They can be managed, but now it's if we see flexibility on both sides, but it's obviously the political dimension that's really problematic. And you're right, Ireland did really have very little choice but to join the EU when the UK first applied in 61, was it? And then when it signed up, because it was so dependent on British trade with Britain then. But since that time, it's absolutely flourished, and its trade with Britain now is in, around whatever it is, 12% or so, 14%. And it's a totally transformed position. So that's where it is now, and it's a very, very strongly pro-European country, as you know.
And actually, that's a thought I never thought about, is that the situation of Ireland has changed significantly since we actually joined. So I can see that. Which I think, please do tell me that is because of its EU membership. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's partly why Ireland is so enthusiastic for the EU, because it became less dependent on Britain. It's not dependent at all on Britain now. And in a funny way, Brexit has kind of even sped up that. So contrary to some of the assumptions that were had, I think, by some pro-Brexit people in Britain who didn't like the Irish border question bothering them. I think they sort of thought, well, Ireland would have no choice but to continue, to move more towards the UK, and even there's a lot of sort of Irexit speculation, etc. That's just so untrue. What you've seen is instead Ireland invest in direct ferry routes to the EU continent, and the relationships, the trading relationships between Britain and Ireland have just dramatically fallen. And that's because Ireland sees, and I could talk a lot about this because I've written a lot about it, but essentially Ireland sees in the EU an enhancement of its sovereignty, right? And a strengthening of its Irish identity and a strengthening of its position in the world. That's what it got through the EU. It came out of the UK's shadow. Whereas obviously in the UK, it saw sovereignty in the EU in very different terms, i.e. as a diminution of it rather than an enhancement of it. And that's because of such different historical experiences.